So, you've heard of this thing called Linux. It's in the Steam Deck, a bunch of YouTubers trying it, but what is it? In this video, I'll try to explain what Linux is, why so many people are talking about it, how to install it, and a bit of general information. And I'll try to explain it without going too much into technical details. What people are mostly referring to when they talk about Linux is Linux the operating system. There are many different kinds of operating systems. For computers, the most popular operating systems are Windows, macOS, and Linux. Operating systems are basically middlemen between the hardware and the user of a computer. It is what allows us to use programs such as Minecraft, etc., without having to think about what's going on underneath. And sometimes it comes with nice graphical user interfaces and buttons that makes a computer very nice to use. To put it very simple, Linux is just an alternative to Windows and macOS.
Now, let's take a look at Windows. If you want to use Windows, one decision you'll have to make is which version of Windows you want to use. So of course there is whether you want Windows 10 or 11, etc. But you also need to choose if you want the Home, Pro, or Enterprise edition. These are all Windows, but there is some differences in what they're capable of.
Linux has actually the same. It's just called distros instead. And there are many different distros you can use. Almost too many. But in the end, they would all still be Linux. Some of the popular ones you can use are Ubuntu, PopOS, Fedora, or Arch. So like with Windows, where you can choose whichever version you want to use, you can here choose whatever distro you want to use. And like the different Windows versions, they will have different looks, different capabilities, and whatever one suits you depends on your personal preference. For the sake of transparency, I should probably say that this comparison is not completely correct, but I feel like it's pretty good for explanation's sake. But now, let's get to the main question you're probably wondering. Why use Linux over other operating systems, such as Windows or macOS? What are the advantages? And let's talk about a few of them. It is likely that the thing you'll hear most people talking about regarding the advantages of Linux is the fact that Linux is an open source operating system, compared to Windows and macOS, which are both closed source. But what does that mean? And why should you care? First of all, to understand that, we need to understand how a program works. Whenever you want to create a program, a programmer will write some code referred to as source code that later will get turned into the file that is able to run on your computer. All programs on your computer were originally written in code. However, most companies will only allow the user access to the file and not to the source code. This can be for many reasons, most likely because the company does not want anyone to be able to copy the program if they have access to the code, but could also be for other reasons, like maybe wanting to hide the fact that the program has data collection built in. If you do not have access to the source code, this is referred to as closed source. If you do have access to the source code, this is referred to as open source. And this is the same for operating systems. They are also written in code. Some are closed sourced and some are open sourced. But again, why does this matter? First, privacy. If anyone is able to read your code, you can't hide software that is spying on the user or anything similar without it being discovered. This means there's generally very little amount of data collection among Linux distributions. Varies a bit, of course, but it tends to be minimal to none. Next, security. Linux being open source means a lot more people are looking for flaws. This might sound like a negative, but in practice it means a lot more people are reporting and finding and fixing exploits as everyone is able to contribute, meaning patches and discoveries can happen almost daily, which is significantly faster than any closed source alternative. Also, downloading software through Linux is typically done through trusted sources instead of random websites on the internet. And permissions for these random softwares is not given by default. And lastly, small bonus on the security front. Since the Linux market share is quite low compared to, for example, Windows, there's very little incentive to create malware for it. Customization. The owner has full control. No BS about being unable to uninstall a program for insert reason here. If the user wants to, they can delete anything they want, including the operating system itself. But anything you want to change, you can change. Different themes, fancy wallpapers, complete overhaul of how the computer works, feel free, nothing is stopping you. If you want some inspiration for all the things you can do, you can check out the subreddit r/UnixPorn, where a lot of people show off all the crazy desktops that they are making. And the last primary advantage of it being open source I want to talk about now is the fact that it's free. There are no license you need to buy, as Linux comes with a GNU General Public License. Just download it and install it on as many computers as you want. Besides that, I also want to talk about some other advantages. For example, the community. Linux has a large and very dedicated community. Whatever problem you'll end up having, there will likely be someone else that also had it, discussing it on a forum or somewhere else, and somewhere you'll be able to find a solution. Next, modularity. I wasn't sure if this should go in the open source category, but now I'm putting it here. Linux can run on almost anything. Because of the many different Linux distributions, you can find distributions designed to work for high-end systems with modern graphics cards and whatnot, like Ubuntu for example. But you can also find Linux distributions designed to work for computers that look like this, like Raspberry Pi OS Lite. A lot of people have managed to bring life into old computers simply by switching to using a Linux distribution, significantly increasing the lifetime of that hardware. This modularity of Linux might also be one of the reasons why we see Linux everywhere. From servers to smart toasters to the base of other operating systems like Chrome OS and Android. Another advantage, stability. Linux tends to be very stable, does not need to be restarted after short periods or when downloading some programs, and tends to have few slowdowns and freezes. And the last advantage that I kind of want to talk about is the fact that competition is good. The fact that there are more competitors in the operating system market is good for the end consumer. If there was just one operating system that had 100% market share, they would be allowed to do whatever they want, because where would the customers go? The fact that Linux is a viable alternative means that if there is a dominant operating system and they do something you do not agree with or morally don't think is right, then you can just switch. And this is something that the developers of said operating system will have to keep in mind, making hopefully the products better for everyone. We could talk more about advantages, but I think this paints a pretty clear picture. However, there are of course also some drawbacks of using Linux, so let's talk about those as well. And let's start with the probably biggest one, compatibility. In the same way that not all programs created on Windows works on Mac, not all programs created for Windows and Mac does work on Linux. This, I believe, is the main drawback of Linux, as certain programs like Word, Adobe Photoshop, Autodesk, and many games are not available on Linux, especially the ones with anti-cheat software. However, I just quickly want to add two things. First, from my observation, ever since the release of the Steam Deck, there has been a huge rise in Linux-compatible games, and it only seems to be increasing. And secondly, I just kind of want to mention that for many of the programs that we use daily, the fact that they're not compatible with Linux is not necessarily a disadvantage. Linux has an environment that thrives on free open source projects. Almost all the programs you can imagine have a free open source alternative on Linux that you can download and use. For example, if you want to use Photoshop, you can download GIMP instead. Adobe Premiere, Kdenlive or DaVinci Resolve. Word, you can use Libra or Google Docs. OneNote, you can use Obsidian as an alternative. So if you're willing to spend a bit of time finding and learning these new tools, missing many of the tools from other operating systems actually is not that big an issue. However, even though many of these programs do have alternatives, switching will mean learning a whole new tool, and often that is just not worth it for people, especially the ones using the tools for professional work, which of course makes sense. Another drawback is what I would call adaptation/technical depth. Linux tend to do a lot of things different than Windows and macOS, and it is sometimes a more technical complex operating system. For example, using the terminal can be quite overwhelming to some people. Things like using the terminal is becoming easier, as many of the functionalities included in the terminal is included as graphical user interfaces in most modern distros. However, it's not the case for all functionality, and as a Linux user, you will most likely have to use the terminal at some point anyway. Hardware compatibility. Even though all hardware can be connected to Linux, driver support can be really hit or miss, leading to some inconsistencies. As far as I can tell, this mostly seems to be problems with the NVIDIA graphics cards, but it does seem to be improving. I have an NVIDIA graphics card, and I have had very little problems. And in general, there are some inconsistencies in Linux. For example, there are problems with refresh rates when you have multiple monitors with different refresh rates. There are different compatibilities of programs between distributions. There are different compatibilities between versions of each distribution. HDR support is being worked on, but still is not perfect as far as I can understand. And stuff like that. But if these drawbacks are something you can live with or are still curious on trying Linux, then how do you actually get started with Linux? What do you need to do? The first thing you'll have to do is to choose a distribution. This is, as far as I can tell, one of the main problems people have with getting into Linux, choosing which distribution they want to use, as that can seem quite overwhelming and many websites do not really make it that clear. So hopefully to help you, I'll now add my small opinion to the conversation. I would highly recommend using the Linux distribution PopOS. Yes, the name is a bit odd, but it is a really good and really popular distribution. And ironically, the main reason why I recommend PopOS over other distributions is because it's based on Ubuntu. Ubuntu is an extremely popular Linux distribution, and because of that popularity, it means that most programs designed for Linux will be designed with Ubuntu in mind, to make sure it runs on it. Because PopOS is based on Ubuntu, it means that basically all programs that are developed for Ubuntu will work on PopOS. It means that most tutorials developed for Ubuntu will work on PopOS, and in general, in my opinion, the more popular something is, the more forums and etc. that are discussing it, the easier it is to use. Ubuntu itself is also a super great Linux distribution, and I would also highly recommend that. But the reason I choose to recommend PopOS a little bit more is because it has been the most plug-and-play experience that I have had. PopOS comes with a bunch of quality of life programs installed by default. It has support for different video codecs and stuff already pre-installed before you begin. It comes with a version designed for NVIDIA drivers specifically that you can update through the same store that you would download all other applications from, making it very easy to use. And it in general feels really complete to me. That being said, I have in no way tried all the different distributions, and you likely have your favorite that you would recommend. And if you do, feel very free to post it in the comment. I would love to hear it. I know a very popular alternative often recommended for people switching from Windows to Linux is MintOS, and I have also had very good experiences using Fedora. To download PopOS, go to their website and download one of the two versions. If you have an NVIDIA graphics card, then I would highly recommend that you download this version. If not, then just download the regular version. If you're completely new to Linux and likely do not feel comfortable replacing your computer's operating system yet, then I would highly recommend that you dip your toes a bit by setting up a virtual machine instead. This allows you to run a simulated version of the Linux operating system on your current operating system without needing to replace it. You can download a program like Oracle VM, link in the description, and set up a virtual machine with the Linux distribution you downloaded before, like shown on screen. And just play around with it, see if you like it. And if you don't like this distribution, try it out going online and find another one. One small note I have to make with this that I have experienced a couple of times is that Windows sometimes won't allow you to run a virtual machine without you going into your BIOS and changing some stuff. I will leave a link for a website on how to fix that in the description, but you can find many others that do it. Just be aware. So, now you have tried your Linux distribution, you liked it, and now you want to install it on an actual machine. Next step. Find a USB stick and use a program like Rufus to combine it with the Linux distribution, making it a bootable drive. Next, make sure your PC is turned off. Insert the USB stick into one of the USB ports, and when turning on the computer, you should enter the computer's BIOS. To enter the BIOS, you need to click a key on the keyboard while the computer is turning on, and what that key is will depend on your computer. On my computer, that key is F2 and delete, but just do a quick Google search on how to enter BIOS using blank computer, and someone will explain. For my Lenovo laptop, for example, that button is also F2. In the BIOS, find the button that will let you boot from the USB. This also is something you just kind of have to search online. After that, go through the installation process, and you're done. You are now a Linux user. Congratulations. To end this video, I just kind of want to talk a bit about some general Linux information. Stuff that you tend to hear a lot of people talking about when discussing Linux. If you're using an Ubuntu-based Linux distribution, like Ubuntu, Pop! OS, Mint, etc., you might hear people talk about something along the lines of Ubuntu version 16.04, 18.04, 20.04, or 22.04. These are all different versions of Ubuntu, with the newest at the time of this video being 22.04. Most things from earlier versions of Ubuntu will still work on 22.04, but some might not. And in my experience, the best support is still on 20.04 at the time of writing. Another thing you might hear is GNOME and KDE. These are the most popular desktop environments and are essentially responsible for how your computer looks, adding a graphical user interface and how they are placed. Most Linux distributions will come with one of these two by default. For example, regular Ubuntu uses GNOME, but variants of Ubuntu, for example called Kubuntu, uses KDE. However, if you prefer one over the other, then you can just download it and switch to the other one. And if you like, let's say GNOME, but there are certain things specifically you don't like, well, then you can just download extensions. For example, if you are on Pop! OS, which uses GNOME, but you want it to look a bit more like Windows, then you can download GNOME Tweaks and download an extension called Dash2Panel, making it look a lot more like Windows. You might also hear people talking about packages, such as RPM, app images, Snap, Flatpak, and deb packages. What is this? All of these are different ways of using a program. To keep it very simple, think of all of them as alternatives to the .exe file on Windows. When downloading a program for Linux, you will likely be asked to download one of these versions. Packages like Snap, Flatpak, and AppImage are designed to work for multiple distributions, while others like deb are designed to work for Debian-based distributions like Ubuntu. All of the different packaging formats have different advantages and disadvantages. Can show some on screen now. As far as I can tell, app images are the closest to the traditional .exe file. Snaps are the most popular. Flatpak seems to be the overall preferred packaging format in the community, but not necessarily the most popular one yet. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but that is my impression. But for the most part, it doesn't matter which one you use. However, one of the main advantages of using these packages is that they often can be downloaded through a packaging system, meaning you don't have to go online, find a random website and hope it doesn't contain a virus. You can download it directly from a secure repository using a packaging system. Wine and Proton. These are tools that allows you to run Windows native programs in Linux. If you, for example, go on Steam and check the games that natively support Linux, the list might seem rather short. However, if you run a Windows game through Proton, it more or less tricks the game into thinking it is on Windows, and it will run. And the same works for many other programs. X11 and Wayland. These are a bit more technical terms, but seems to be discussed a lot in the Linux community, so I thought I might add a little about them. X11 and Wayland are desktop environment window managers. They are responsible for drawing windows, bars, and in general a lot related to what is being displayed on the screen and how it does it. X11 has been implemented and used for a long time and will likely be the default in most Linux distributions you use. Wayland, on the other hand, is a newer alternative that comes with many benefits, but at the time of writing this video, still might not be a replacement for everyone. It does to me, however, seem that we are working towards switching to Wayland for most distributions at some point. Lastly, to end this video, I just want to add a little comment. Sadly, there is still a lot of things on Linux that require a terminal. Depending on what distribution you choose, this might be more or less. But I will, however, say that the terminal is not as scary as it may look, and can even be an amazing tool once you get familiar with it. If you look on screen now, what I'm doing on the left side is more or less the same as I'm doing on the right side. For the most part, I am only typing in a few commands, or I'm copying commands I find online, and through time, these commands stick with me, and I can just do them without even thinking. Anthony from Linus Tech Tips explained very well why using the terminal can be an advantage over using traditional graphical windows in this video that I would highly recommend. On Windows, if you want to do many things, like for example figuring out how to check what hardware you have, you have to go online, search on it, find a guide on which menus you need to go into, which folders, tabs, whatever, to find your solution. Go through that to get the information. On Linux, you search online, but you just find a command, you type it, and done. Same solution, but solved in two different ways. And once you know this command once, it is very quick to do again. This will, of course, take some getting used to, and might be quite weird for some. But the terminal can be a really powerful tool once you get used to it. And that was everything I could think that would be useful for a beginner in Linux. I hope you found this video useful. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.